Trexler.
Helms.
It's just you and I today on the Iron Culture.
The way it should be, the way it's supposed to be, the way God intended.
That's right. That's right. I mean, you could argue that perhaps Omar and I starting this means that maybe he should be involved, but things change. Old Testament, New Testament, like you said, the way God intended.
No, Omar and Helms walked so that Helms and Trex could run.
I love it. Wow.
Yeah.
I think, you know what? We're standing on either shoulder of a giant. Some may argue that he is being crushed by us and he's begging for us to get off of him. But we know that that progress requires sacrifice, mainly on the part of Omar.
Human sacrifice in this case.
Human sacrifice, exactly. At the top of the pyramid. So, today you are the beneficiaries of that sacrifice of Omar. And you know what? I haven't asked our audience how they feel about that, but given that this is a not necessarily a democracy with us ruling on high, I'm going to go ahead and just say that they are comfortable with that because once I've said it, it is true.
Yeah, I think I know for sure based on reading our reviews that they'd be more comfortable if one of the Erics was, perhaps the one getting crushed. And I think we all know which one that is.
We do. And we don't need to go into it any further than that because one thing that I am for sure is that we both need to protect our inner insecurities with this shield of narcissism. And the only way that two narcissists can coexist is by both secretly seeing the other person as something that we don't need to say and seeing themselves as something else, which we don't need to say. Are you happy with that?
Yes.
Okay. So, with the obligatory peacekeeping out of the way that is necessary in any kind of multi-person relationship, even when that third person in the relationship is just a platform with which you are currently standing on, let's talk about the topic. So Eric, I have been kind of wrestling with trying to reconcile a number of different concepts that are evidence-informed, personally informed through my experience as an athlete, and also personally informed through my years of coaching. And this has actually been something that I really want to give a big shout out to the Data-Driven Strength crew, Zach and Josh, the last 2 episodes of their podcast. By the way, if you're not listening to the Data-Driven Strength podcast and you like our more sciencey episodes, you're missing out, team. But currently now, Dr. Zach Robinson, soon to be Dr. Pelland, they had some really good conversations around maintenance volume, maintenance dose, training age, and whether or not the required dose to adapt changes over time and increases with training age. And I think this is where we have a number of different narratives, which, as the cliche but true saying is, all models are wrong, but some models are useful, where some of the elements of the wrongness of these models starts to come apart and we don't have a cohesive understanding of this. And I'm going to try to impart upon you, dear listener, an understanding of the relationship between training age, what is required to maintain a certain level of gains, what is required to make progress, and what might optimize things, and why there seems to be anecdotes and narratives that don't connect, but seem to be true in certain cases, but not others on this topic. Trexler, your role is to take my potentially scattered thoughts and keep me on track, hold my feet to the fire, make sure that what I'm saying is actually cohesive in some nature, and hopefully focus my scattered brain into something that is useful. Are you up to that challenge?
Focus your rage into something productive rather than destructive.
Yes, I am. I am raw potential. I am the Padawan, and you are my sensei. You are my Jedi master. Can you focus me?
Absolutely. And I do want to point out one note of clarification. You said that you've been wrestling with this idea, but I think we all know that you have been lying awake at night, agonizing over this topic, staring at the ceiling in a cold sweat. You haven't been sleeping. You look terrible, no appetite. the whole 9 yards. So if nothing else, even if nothing productive or informative comes of this, I'm just happy that you're getting it off your chest, because I want you to get back to that point where you are no longer just riddled with anxiety over this. I want you to be able to sleep and eat again. So let's spend an hour or so. Let's get it out. Let's talk through it. Maybe people find some useful things to help them kind of forecast their volume in their lifting career. Maybe, people just get to enjoy Helms liberating himself from this heavy burden he's been carrying for quite some time. So we'll see how it goes.
No, thank you. And then I appreciate you pointing out that service that we're doing for me on top of the potential educational benefits. So, Trexler, you admitted recently that you're not necessarily as in touch with the bodybuilding community and culture as you used to be, but I think this is probably something that supersedes that. The perspective on, I'm going to say the dose, which I think is an important distinction rather than volume, that is required over the course of a training career. I would say that the overwhelming consensus, maybe not entirely overwhelming, but I would say the broad consensus is that as you become more advanced in your lifting career, you need to do more. And there's only arguments around what more means and whether that's constrained or focused more on intensity or volume. And that's why I'm using the term dose very specifically here. But would you agree that is something that most people believe to be true?
I would certainly get on board with that with one qualifier. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you used the term training age. Is that correct?
Yes.
The only little asterisk with the tiny footnote in, size 8 font, maybe in Jokerman font or Wingdings, non-serious Comic Sans, whatever.
Comic Sans, that's preferred.
I prefer using the term training status.
I like that.
Just because I'm Helms, I'm sure you have as well, had conversations with folks who say, I'm an advanced lifter. And I say, well, how do you know that? And they say, because I've been lifting for 8 years. And I'm like, what have those 8 years looked like? And they're like, well, I'm an advanced lifter, but I haven't gotten very strong or very big. And the first 7.5 years of my training was not a productive way to approach training. So I'm like, okay, so you've been training for 6 months in a meaningful way, right? So training age, sometimes people make it this simple. When's the first time you stepped in a weight room and how old are you today? Whereas training status says, hey, I've made big strides over my training career and got to that point where I really need to squeeze out, I need to perfect the little things in order to squeeze every drop out of these gains.
So it is essentially what we're trying to encapsulate with the term training status is a better one. How much have you adapted relative to your potential to adapt?
Right.
I think that to be clear is what we're after. And this is a challenging thing to nail down. So for example, we try to do the best we can in study designs by requiring both a minimum training age or years of experience of being in the weight room. And then sometimes we will also impose a certain objective standard in sports science research specifically of how high are you in your sport. But then what is, say, your relative strength? Can you at least squat 1.5 times body mass? And this is still imperfect because as legend goes, Andy Bolton, if you're not familiar, at one time held the world record on the deadlift. The very first time he deadlifted 600 pounds. So there's a question as to whether or not, or the degree to which individual response variation really does matter compared to baseline starting point. So think about it this way. Let's pretend Andy Bolton was just starting lifting now. And let's also pretend that I was a lot stronger than I currently am, and that I had slightly better potential for powerlifting. Let's say that within 5 years, I was able to deadlift 600 pounds instead of what actually happened was that within 5 years, I was able to deadlift 500 pounds, okay? And let's say that Andy Bolton and I both went to do the same powerlifting competition within maybe the first year of his training. And I was trying to go from 600 to 700, and he was also trying to go from 600 to 700. We both placed similarly in the competition, let's say we're both in the same weight class. Again, this is a different version of Eric Helms. I don't even know why I need to be the person in this. Let's just say somebody else.
You signed yourself up for this. I think you just wanted to talk about Eric Helms trying to chase like a 700-pound deadlift. I think that's it.
I'm still trying to chase a 600-pound deadlift. So we're living in the dream world already. But okay, let's say we got the super heavyweight, stronger version of Eric Helms that I wish I was, but I am not. He is probably going to look across the aisle at Andy Bolton and think we're in the same place. We're both in our late stage intermediate, early stage advanced gains. And if I can match this guy, I'm going to beat him at nationals. So what happens when we get to nationals? He deadlifts 750 and I deadlift 680. And I'm like, crap, he is a higher responder than I am. And responder is potentially, what I might be thinking is that the rate of progress he's making as a function of who he is faster than mine. But it might actually be that if I was in the stage of my career, the rate at which he's progressing from 600 to 700 was the same rate at which I progressed from 450 to 550, but his baseline was higher, and as a proportion, it's actually quite similar. But the experience we're having, because objectively we're being evaluated differently, or rather on the same terms in a competitive environment, is, oh man, this guy is a higher responder to resistance training. And that is sort of true if we think about baseline differences. And also, therefore, if there is an eventual such thing as a plateau where you have capped out your potential, if that potential is relative to where you started, at least to some degree, then it could be in a way true. Even though if you were to match us for our training status, our potential relative to our maximum, there might not actually be a difference in the rate of gain, or it would be smaller than anticipated. So that's where this conversation gets messy, because we don't have any objective way of knowing where you're at relative to your maximum capacity. And of course, that's why we constantly have videos of natural potential. How do I reach my potential? How much should I be gaining? What's a novice? What's an intermediate? What's an advanced? So
well,
I think that's...
You forgot my favorite genre of video, natty or not.
Natty or not, exactly. Yeah, that's the more likely outcome that would have occurred from us both going to nationals and him deadlifting 715 and me deadlifting 680 is not me actually thinking, oh, maybe he had a naturally higher starting point and he was more gifted, but he must have hopped on the sauce and I didn't, and now I can protect my ego.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's somebody who deadlifted 500 pounds, has been training for 10 years, and who thinks we're both on the sauce, and he's just taking more, and I'm taking less. And now we've explained the internet.
Yep.
So, okay. So with that understanding, now we can kind of look at what has the experience been as a coach. It's very possible that you get that person who's been training for a year or year and a half and has a much higher starting point who signs up for your coaching. And you also get that person who's been training for 5 years and they're at a relative similar point. And in your mind, it's ambiguous as to whether they're advanced, late stage novice, late stage intermediate. And if they don't give you good information on your background, that coach will now have the perception that some people are higher responders to training than others, right? And that may or may not be true. Again, I do think there is probably such a thing as individual response variations, specifically looking at the rate of progress, but we know for sure that people start at different points and a bit of a black box after that, and that people have different potentials. Okay. So now we have to think about the interaction of training dose. And this is where it gets confusing because there are people out there who have achieved incredible results and achieve what we would objectively determine as a champion level physique or a champion level of strength on what seems to be a very, very small dose of training that for others seems insufficient for them to achieve that same height of performance. Is that an observation that you would agree with, Trex?
Absolutely.
For sure. And I can think of this not like the first thing that pops in your head is, Arnold versus Menser, but we can make it a little more sanitized. I can think of a number of natural bodybuilders who do relatively low volume and have made progress, not just achieved something then maintained it, versus those who seem to do a lot more to get to a similar place, right? That is probably some expression of that conundrum that I talked about and the fickleness of the complete or incomplete information you have and how we gauge things. So that's why I don't think there is the clear-cut answer of the dose must go up in terms of volume over time. And some people, especially in the high-intensity world, would say, no, you need to do a very small amount of volume, but you just need to keep training to failure. And as you get stronger, that failure is going to be with a higher load. So you've met the demands and you're good to go. And that could be true, but we've actually tested that hypothesis and it does not seem to be true. So the first point of evidence that I want to bring up is a study that was actually recently published by none other than the good man, Dr. James Steele, who is an excellent sports scientist, excellent statistician, and design specialist, titled Long-Term Time Course of Strength Adaptation to Minimal Dose Resistance Training Through Retrospective Longitudinal Growth Monitoring. And the cool thing about this study, it was on nearly 15,000 participants, 60% female, so about 40% male, if I did my math right, assuming that there weren't folks who didn't identify as male or female in that sample. They were middle-aged, so they were 48 plus or minus 11 years, which would make me think for the most part, they're going to be adapting in a similar way to even to a younger population. It's probably not an age-related constraint. And it tracked them for nearly 7 years. Okay, so this is pretty cool. This is not the typical type of data that we have in sports science. And they were only training each muscle group one time per week with a single set to momentary muscular failure with a personal trainer there. So we can have some confidence in that is probably what was happening most of the time. So if it was true that the typical person could just do a single set per exercise, train to failure, and just increase load as needed to fail within that same rep range, we should see a generalizable adaptation in these folks that would match our anecdotes in the real world. What actually happened, though, is that within the first 1 to 2 years, they reached a plateau. And it wasn't explained by sex, body weight, or age. Substantial strength gains occurred, but 30 to 50% of them occurred in the first year, and the remaining 50 to 60% occurred over the next 6 years, but the vast majority of it all occurred in the first 2 years for almost everybody. So they were effectively stuck at whatever level of their potential, their training status plateaus around that 1 to 2 year mark. So now what I've seen as a coach, what I've seen as an athlete, is that people who are not locked into just doing one set to failure per week, they do something when they hit that 1 to 2 year mark. Because I am personally not, I'm not currently plateaued anymore. I know many people who are not, who are way past that point. And more often than not, what they do is if they were doing a single set to failure, is maybe they think about doing a second set or a second day. I don't know, is that something you've observed?
If they really catch the bug, they might throw that second set in there.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you rarely find people who say, you know what, I'm going to stick with this long term, and I'm not going to change a thing ever.
Yep. I also think, the typical kind of observation or the nihilistic black-pilled version in the natty world of this is you made all your gains in the first 5 to 7 years.
Oh, yeah. If you wanted to convince someone, let's say that, a friend or a significant other is spending way too much time in the gym, and you want to, in a very dishonest, very sneaky way, ruin their life and separate them from lifting. Here's what you do. Here's the surefire way to achieve that. You show them this study and you say, hey, listen, everything that you're ever gonna achieve is done. Okay? You are now spinning your wheels in perpetuity. Also, remember this study where people on steroids who don't lift gain more mass than people that are not on steroids who do lift. You're done. Okay? There's no point. Give up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But I do think it's telling that the narrative is 5 to 7 years, and then maybe you can have some spurts here and there, not 1 to 2 years. So, and I think the reason that occurs is that most people are not doing one set to failure per week when they first start training. And that is a unique aspect of this study, which is really informative to this discussion. Because you got a whole bunch of people who didn't lift. They started, the 6-year study, on average, they're 48 years old, right? So you got a whole bunch of people starting as middle-aged folks who didn't have a prior history of lifting. And they're doing a HIIT protocol, a minimum effective dose truly, and they're seeing a plateau at the 1 to 2 year mark. I think the average person who just gets exposed to the YouTube fitness community is probably doing 5 to 10 times that amount. They're probably doing something between 5 to 15 sets if I had to guess the 2 standard deviation out amount. So it doesn't surprise me that is going to result in some type of plateau 2 years later. Now, The next assumption that I don't think is true would be, okay, well then when they plateau, if they've been doing 5 to 15 sets, they've got to do 15 to 30. That's where I think we struggle. And that's where there's a disconnect. And I think we need to think about the complex, multivariate nature of this relationship. And here's where I'm going to get into it a little bit. These folks could probably maintain this intermediate level of fitness forever doing one set to failure. So their minimum effective dose has become their maintenance dose. But they've never gotten past the intermediate stage. So what we can infer from this is that as your adaptation increases, you will actually plateau if you're not doing a sufficient dose at something below your potential. And therefore, you might need to do more to advance past it. And now, all of a sudden, there's a dose that could result in regression back to where you were previously. And we actually have anecdotal support for this as well. So the good news is that we have a fair amount of case series, case studies, and even some actual comparative controlled trials where we look at highly trained strength athletes. So for example, there's a great study where they looked at 2 national level weightlifters in the US, a case series, going to nationals. So these are very high level lifters. They're competing at the national level in an Olympic sport. And they went through this periodized plan that included an element of linearity. So 11 weeks out from competition, now they're looking at measures of cross-sectional area, as well as, say, squat jump performance and their actual performance in nationals. So shout out to Travis, preparing for a national weightlifting championship at Case Series. Great study published in 2020. The really interesting thing is as they go through this tapering phase and strength block, so now they've taken the amount of volume they were doing at their peak, of which they were doing to accumulate muscle mass and hopefully increase their potential for strength down the track. We're seeing that as they go through this linear progress, volumes coming down, intensities going up, there are actually measurable decreases greater than the typical error in cross-sectional area. So that means they're doing more than the minimum dose, which is observed in this 15,000 person study, and losing muscle, right? So, and it's not the only one. This isn't just this isolated study out there. There's also a great study on a similar topic by I think Suarez. And then there's also the minimum effective dose training that came out of Dr. Pack, Androulakis Korakakis' PhD, where he said, hey, if we just do a single 3 times per week on bench at a high RPE, twice a week on squat, 1 time a week on deadlift, there's some gains. Some people don't make gains, and we see a plateau around the 4 to 6 week mark. But if we simply add 3 back offsets after each one of those days, now everybody's making great gains. At least in aggregate, the vast majority of people. So we can see that there is this relationship between training age, is that you will never get to the point where you're intermediate if the dose is too low. So you can maintain something below that with a very low dose. But therefore, what do you need to maintain a higher level of that? Well, your MED, your minimum effective dose, is rising with your training age. And here's where the third wrinkle comes in, Trex. It's that gains are something we assess in a reality that has time, and in a reality where we have interpersonal comparisons, and sometimes in a reality of sport, right? So an objective standard. So what we deem to be a plateau, I think more often than not, is just an unacceptable or an unrecognizable rate of progress. It's too slow. We either can't tell that it's actually happening. I don't want to wait 6 years to add, a quarter centimeter to my bicep circumference. I'm competing next year. I want to see a measurable change. And we're seeing this, curvilinear response to where slower and slower gains as we get closer to our peak potential. So if we know that we're never even going to become an intermediate unless we do more volume than the minimum dose, we're seeing our rising minimum effective dose to maintain things. And then if we start to expect a certain level of progress, like if I'm an intermediate, I'm used to novice gains. I want that rate again. And the only way for me to even get close to my novice rate of gains is to increase the stimulus to get an increased return on the efforts I'm putting in, but notably a decreased return on the unit of investment. Meaning that I might have to do 20 sets to get half the gains that I got when I was doing 10 sets. and I have to deal with all the life constraints, fatigue, and all those other things that are occurring. So I'm not necessarily increasing my ability to handle that amount of work. And I'm not necessarily, because I'm bigger and stronger, getting more time off work or less stress or more sleep in the day.
What a weird world we live in, though. Like, you should be able to go to your employer and say, listen, we all know I've gotten much stronger, much more muscular. Therefore, I should be able to make the same salary while giving you less of my time and effort. It seems to me that that would be a very equitable system, but as you've noted, very few employers are willing to do that.
No, and it's ironic because you're explaining to them, listen, I am trying to make the same salary of gains that I made 2 years ago, but I have to work twice as much to get half that salary. So you can't help me out here? Come on, bro.
Yeah.
You know? So this leads to a very consistent anecdote that I have as a coach and I also have as a personal athlete, that the intermediate slump, that intermediate quote unquote plateau, seems to be broken very consistently by increasing volume in intermediates. That is something that I've just heard repeated too many times for it not to be at least something that we're all collectively hallucinating about, right? What I think is actually happening is that in many cases, it is just people are unsatisfied with the level of progress they're making as an intermediate compared to being a novice. And that's exacerbated by if they were using a relatively minimalistic approach to training like they were as a novice. And if you go on any Reddit forum, any place, and you go, what's a good beginner program? They tell you a lot of these low to moderate programs like starting strength or 5x5, typically doing 5 or 6 sets of the basic compound movements. And you will see fantastic progress on that, but you'll also see fantastic progress on anything when you first start lifting. So now you have the capacity to do more. You need to do more if you want to even approximate the rate of progress you made previously, but you're not actually plateaued. If we were to stick you in the growth modeling study like this and you stuck with, say, a 5 set per muscle group protocol training at a high proximity to failure, you might actually make it to that 5 or 7 year mark before you start to plateau. But if we asked you retrospectively, how did you feel about your gains from years 4 to 5? You'd be like, I wasn't making any gains from year 4 to 5. And you go, no, look at the chart. You increased your squat by 10 pounds. And you're like, yeah, but I increased my squat by 200 pounds in my first 2 years. So it didn't feel like I was progressing and I didn't even notice it. And I think that means that even though from a very, very literal perspective, you are not plateaued, we don't assess plateaus based upon whether we're adding imperceptible amounts of grams of tissue over years. We assess plateaus based upon the goals we have, the desires we have, and the people around us. For another real world example, I competed in 2023. I got my WNBF pro card. That was amazing. And I did okay at Worlds. I placed 7th out of 9th. And I decided to set a very arbitrary goal that I don't have a lot of agency over of, I'd really like to crack the top 5 in the WNBF pro middleweights at Worlds in 2025. Because that's what we do with goals. We make them time bound when they're objective like that. But I've been lifting for 20 years, Trex. I don't know if I actually can make the level of progress that I need to make to improve by 2025. But I do know that if I want to try, I have to increase the rate of progress that I'm getting. And I think when someone simply just looks at my program and they go, oh my God, why is Eric doing 20 to 30 sets on most of his muscle groups? That's unnecessary. It probably is. I think I could probably maintain my level of size on half of that, if not maybe even a little bit less. And I could probably even make progress, albeit at a too slow of a rate, I think, for what my goals are, on maybe 1 or 2/3 of what I'm doing. Like, do I really think I couldn't make progress on 20 sets? Do I actually need 30? Need is the operational word there. If I want to give myself every chance to place higher WNBF Worlds, knowing the freaks I'm up against, maybe I should be doing 35 sets. I don't know. I can't know, right? I'll only know once I'm sitting on that stage, either disappointed or happy. Honestly, I'm going to be happy no matter what, because I know the efforts I've put forth. But from an objective standpoint, I am playing in a world of unknowns, and I am trying to leverage this relationship to the best of my capability and knowledge, understanding that I can only retrospectively know whether it was the right decision or not. So I think that creates this artificial perception that the dose must always escalate, I think when in reality, there's probably a maximal rate that one can progress at. You don't know when you're past it. And there are risks to going above it. I'm not saying that the more volume you do, the more likely you are to get hurt, or that the inverted U, you're actually going to start regressing. I think it's probably more of this long plateau of making equivalent progress, but you're just wasting your efforts and you're doing a lot of work for no return. So I think there's not too much risk if you can recover from it and if you have the time in your schedule. But I think that kind of illusion persists a lot, and it's what leads to these lack of understandings. And I can also understand why some of the high intensity folks totally disagree. So for example, if you started with a very high volume approach and you are a high responder, you are someone with a higher baseline who does very well with a given dosage of training, and you find you're getting burned out doing 20 sets per week because you've been doing it for the first 3 years, and you have maxed out your rate of progress because you're a high responder, and you would actually do just fine on 5 sets, you start doing HIIT, all of a sudden your recovery is through the roof, you're happier, you're spending not as much time, you're spending a more appropriate time in the gym, maybe the better aligns with your life goals, you're feeling better, you're less achy and creaky, and you're making the same or perhaps even slightly better gains. All of a sudden, you're a HIIT convert. But really what happened is you just were doing an unnecessary amount initially, and you happened to respond very well to training. So I think this model at least explains a lot of what we observe. The other anecdote that I think is really interesting is that some people notice that as they get more advanced, not necessarily just an intermediate, but they don't require as much volume. How often have you heard people say that, Trex?
That they don't require as much volume when they get more advanced?
There's a certain point where they actually need to scale things back a little bit. Have you heard that?
I've heard it some, but admittedly not as much as the inverse. I think it's more common to hear people say, I'm advanced, therefore I need all the volume that could possibly be fit into the time I have available. But I have heard some folks who say, now, a lot of times it comes from the perspective, I've maxed out whatever I could possibly hope to get from volume, so now I'm shifting my focus back to intensity. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a pretty persistent thing that I notice when I see these anecdotal observations. And I think the fundamental truth behind it is that you can't fast track to the same degree. You can always add more volume. Like right now, anyone could start doing 40 sets per week if they had the time availability and if they didn't get hurt to prevent them to keep training. However, some skills of lifting that occur in the gym, not in the theories and listening to Iron Culture podcast, they can't be fast-tracked to that degree. And that is knowing how to push to failure, gauging proximity to failure, and actually performing exercises in such a way that does put the stress on the right tissues, or that you're improving your motor patterns and getting better and better at just the skill of lifting and the mental fortitude required to train. So what I see is a lot of people who are not yet skilled lifters, they start to push the thing that they can push right now, the thing they can fast track, which is do more and more volume each time I plateau. And I do think it works, but once their skill level finally catches up with their neuroticism and their passion and their willingness to do all of that, they find that every unit of training can now actually be more effective. If you ask them, what were you doing when you were in your second year of training? They say, I was doing 20 sets to failure. And in reality, what they were doing is perhaps they were doing 20 sets of poorly performed, maybe not great exercise selection exercises at a 5 RAR. And now they're actually doing exercises that better suit their biomechanics. They have learned more about what is a more effective technique or exercise, and they're actually training at say a 1 or a 2 RAR. And then now they're all of a sudden they only need half of that volume and they're progressing maybe even better. And I think I can demonstrate how this absolutely could be true if we take a look at some of the research that's out there. So very recently, there's been a study where they compared hypertrophy in the hamstrings between doing bent leg and you're thinking, well, Eric, why are we going to be talking about long muscle lengths again? We'll just take it for what it is.
No, it's when you talk to Eric Helms, it could be calling him to wish him a happy birthday, of which he's had many. It could be any non-fitness conversation. It will get to
Yes.
long muscle length training and specifically hamstring training. I don't remember the last time I talked to you and we didn't talk about some combination of long muscle length training and either hamstring training or, of course, calf training. And I
Yes.
talk to you at least 4 days a week. So this has been going for months on end.
Then it won't stop.
Yeah.
Until we start investigating different muscles. I probably could use a bicep example if I wanted to, but I'm not going to just because you said that.
Yeah.
So we're going to stick with the hamstring example.
The
Seated
hamstrings,
hamstring curl.
which include the real biceps, right?
The real biceps, yes,
Yeah.
sir. So we got seated hamstring curls versus lying hamstring curls. It's far more common for people to do the lying hamstring curls. They're a more common piece of equipment historically, and they're a little less pain in the ass to set up, and they fit more people's bodies in my very casual observation. However, you can see like a 50% better hypertrophy response in some of the studies in certain muscle groups doing seated hamstring curls versus lying hamstring curls. Okay. So let's just say you were doing lying hamstring curls and you switched to seated hamstring curls. Same amount of sets, same proximity to failure. You could see 50% better growth in some muscle groups. That's a thing. So when we use this very imprecise metric of sets per week per muscle group to failure, there's a lot of things baked into that. You change out the quality of that exercise for how good it is for that muscle group to grow, relationship changes. We go, oh, actually, your ability to gauge RIR was terrible, and now it changes. We see that you could potentially be experiencing a 50% difference if you're farther from failure than you really understood you were if we get pretty far down on that track, right? So those qualitative aspects are often baked into training experience. We do have some data to support the notion that you get better and better at gauging proximity to failure the more experience you have in the gym and with that metric. That's not super well shown, and there are some data that would contradict that to some degree, but I think the general leaning is that is probably the case. So if you're actually training to failure, and if you are actually using more effective exercises, that may change things. I would also state that you can only impose so much stress on your body as a beginner because of those factors. When you see these rapid changes in strength neuromuscularly, that tells you that you're using a load that is actually not that morphologically challenging, to use a weird term, when you're not yet getting those early stage adaptations, when your technique is shit, when you are unable to actually target the effective muscle group, when you think you're close to failure, but you're not. So I think there is a point where some people start to be more savvy in their exercise selection, more accurate in their RIR estimations, and also are performing exercises more effectively and getting more out of themselves to where every unit of volume becomes more effective. And if you were already on a low volume program, maybe that just offsets the rate of progress. But if you start with a high volume program and then you're just getting burned out from all the time spent and you go to a low volume program after or as you're making those adaptations, I think that pretty well explains why some advanced lifters go, whoa, the things actually got better or stayed the same when I decreased my volume. Maybe I had it wrong all these years and maybe everyone else is just talking mess and they don't know what they're saying.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think that tracks?
Yeah. So basically, you have quantifiably reduced the volume of your training, but in a way you've simultaneously adjusted the dose of the stimulus, so to speak, by having a much higher quality and higher intensity effort. So it's a step down in volume, but still actually a step up in the overall stimulus.
Absolutely. And this is why, shout out to introducing the concepts, popularizing them, and talking about them. I don't mean this to be a shot, but the Renaissance periodization, kind of Mike Israel discussion of the minimum effective volume, maximum effective volume, and maximum recoverable volume, I don't find them to be as useful of terms as if we just replace that word volume with dose.
Yeah.
Because there is a pretty large interaction between these factors that can make the volumes really change. But if we just thought about it from the collective stimulus, now we can go, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that's what I like about this this modeling study out of Steele is they're starting with, I have a coach guiding me to momentary muscular failure, and we're time and we have a time as a factor, and we've held constant. It's one set per muscle group per week. So we don't have that type of clean observational relationships. So we have to in the real world, or even in other studies. So we have to kind of pick apart and explain these things. So ultimately, what we see here is a relationship where as you get closer and closer to your potential, the minimum effective dose does rise. And if you were doing 8 sets at a 70% out of 100% effectiveness to get there, you could potentially drop to 5 sets at 100% effectiveness, and you're actually in a pretty similar place, and you might be able to keep progressing. And you think, oh, did my minimum effective dose go down? It did not. Did my volume requirement go up? Well, the minimum requirement did go up to maintain the level of adaptation you're at, but you could drop down and you would regress to your intermediate stage, or you'd regress to your novice stage from wherever you were. And I think a parallel for this, which is useful, is when we start thinking about other fitness adaptations, when we get a little bit outside of the realm of muscle mass and strength. Anyone who's participated in endurance sport long enough to get pretty damn fit knows that if they were to go on the casual walking or jogging program that would take someone sedentary into a level of acceptable health, where your markers look good and you're no longer at risk for falls or early death, they would actually regress. Trex, what's a high level VO2 max for, let's say, a cyclist or a runner? You know this better than I do.
Like elite?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, 70s?
Sure.
70-something milligrams per kilogram.
So if you took someone at a 70 VO2 max and you gave them the current activity level guidelines, well, what is that, like 250 minutes of moderate exercise or something like that per week? I can't remember.
Easy, 150.
150. See?
Yeah, chill.
So if you gave 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise to someone with a 70 VO2 max, would you predict that they would maintain a 70 VO2 max?
I would not.
I wouldn't either. I think they would probably regress to something substantially lower. I think they'd probably lose 10, 20%,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So this is not necessarily a crazy concept. And to get back to it, they wouldn't require the same amount that they required to maintain 70, They could probably just add another 100 minutes and they get up to I'm 90% of where I was. But to actually make visible progress over time when you already have a 70 VO2 max, it's going to be either some not too much volume, but some insane intervals at a very, very high intensity, percentage of your heart rate max, which, we see parallels of that in the bodybuilding world. I remember watching Blood and Guts, Dorian Yates's video, and he was actually asked, well, what if you do a plateau? And he said, well, you have to find a way to increase the intensity. So he was operating in an environment of I have a fixed amount of volume, and which wasn't as low as a lot of people think it was, but 4 to 8 sets per muscle group or something like that, doing some kind of warm-up sets and some pre-exhaust. And they would do forced reps, or he'd control the eccentric even longer or something like that. You can see these intensification techniques. You can go that route. We have more options on the table now, like letting a range of motion decay until you're barely just pulsing in that lengthened position. So that individual set becomes more effective. There was actually recently, and now we're going to talk about the calves, there was a recent study where they compared continuing a set until you're barely even doing a half rep, doing lengthened partial supersets, right? So you do one group just does calf raises and stops once they don't do the typical movement standard. The other group just changes the definition of failure. Okay, I can no longer do a quarter of a rep, and now they're growing more. So you've kind of trained past failure, if we want to use colloquial terminology.
Yeah, and what a world that we live in. I guess I'm now at that age where all the myths of my childhood have died. All of the cliches of my childhood are now, out of style. I remember when I learned to lift and I had very angry strength coaches yelling at me. They said, if you're not completing the full repetition, you are wasting your time. And more importantly, you're disrespecting your team. You are disrespecting your coach, disrespecting the building that you lift in, and bringing shame to your family. That was all from only completing 3/4 of a rep. And now these Gen Z kids are coming through here saying, hey, only do half of a repetition. I don't know what to think anymore, Helms. The world is changing too fast, and at my age, it concerns me, and it frankly scares me.
Well, that's why you need someone who is truly older than you, because I was saying the same things, not about Gen Z, but about millennials, of which you are one.
Yeah.
And all I can say is, you know what? You guys didn't ruin the world. Gen Z maybe won't either, but I'm not super confident in that. All I know is that the world still exists, even though we've had now what appears to me as 2 generations of completely insane people who are doing terrible things because I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, you said that we haven't ruined the world, but I will remind you, the average age of an American politician is actually 87. So we haven't really had a chance to make our mark yet. So give us about 40 years, and then we reach true adulthood in our 8th decade of life, into the 9th decade of life, and we'll see what we can cook up.
Beautiful. So I just need to hold on until I'm a lot older to see if you guys ruined it, and then anything that was probably at least attributable to my generation, I can blame on you.
Yes.
Win-win. So, no, I get it. I think things are changing. But the good news is that sometimes in that changing environment of information, we come to a better understanding. And I feel like we're getting a little closer to understanding this concept of dosages and the interaction with training age. And I think I get why people are confused about this, because dose is the aggregate of the intensity and also the amount of that intensity you're doing. And we can encapsulate intensity to include, we can just call it efficiency, like how effective is every unit of volume, which is going to come down to exercise selection, how well you perform it, how close to failure you get, et cetera. And then just how much of that do you do? So there's that. And then there's also the recovery factor, I think an interesting thing about hypertrophy is that you can be doing a very, very high level of volume and you can be growing, but your performance may be more variable because you're struggling and you're always kind of in and out of recovery, even though you're still doing a sufficient amount to actually produce a stimulus. And you're probably seeing some drop off in the efficiency even within a series of sets or session. So it's a messy, complex relationship just to define the training dose. And now we're thinking about, okay, what's the least amount I need to maintain? And now what's the least amount I need to see progress? And what's the amount that I need to see the progress that I actually want? And then there's a theoretical maximal amount of progress, but we actually never know when we're there. We just know, can we see it and are we satisfied with it? Most of the time the answer is no. So we try to do more, or we try to increase the efficiency of it, and on the game goes. But I think when we look at the data and we match it up to the anecdotes, there is a cohesive narrative here. We see that minimum effective dose can only get you to an appropriate level of adaptation for which that minimum effective dose is sufficient to achieve. So it might be 1 set per week to failure if you're satisfied with plateauing around the 1 to 2 year mark at probably what we would describe as an intermediate. And it may not be much higher than that if you want a plateau, what would be described as a high-level intermediate if you want that to occur in the 5 to 10 year mark. And if you really want to get those gains as quickly as you can and achieve a higher level, here's where the disconnect is that I want to retouch on. It might be even more than that, But I think the fallacy is that some people think it's just a difference in the rate of progress. Like, yeah, you can follow HIIT, but it'll take you 20 years to get there. And I actually don't think that is true. I think the rate of progress is either so slow or it's just an insufficient amount to nudge over the quote unquote anabolic resistance to get higher, that as we saw in this, multi-year long study, again, in 15,000 individuals over almost a 7-year period, there really was not much more progress after the first 2 years. These people are probably never going to become advanced, no matter how long you watch them. So there's a certain minimum amount you need to reach each quote unquote threshold that we would objectively define as novice, intermediate, and advanced. And again, it's so hard to gauge that because one person's advanced, we talk about that Andy Bolton versus fake Eric Helms comparison, is another person's novice stage. So I think the minimum dose does increase with training age. And then the minimum dose required to see a level of progress that we're satisfied with probably also increases, but the actual responsiveness may not. It may just be that we have to accept a slower rate or do more, a technically unnecessary amount of more, to get some approximation of a rate that we are appreciative of. So that's how I see it. That mental model makes sense to me. It is robust to the anecdotes that I've observed, and it is also fits the data that exists. But the real thing I need to test is, does it fit Dr. Eric Trexler's interpretation of the data and anecdotes? Because he's a smarter, more cohesively thinking man than I am.
Yeah. As you've been explaining this, I've already prepared a 3-article rebuttal series, picking apart many elements of your argument. No, I have. I think you laid that out really well. And I think, like you said, it's probably the best we can do right now with what we have available in terms of data and what seem to be fairly repeatable anecdotes. And I do think, Helms, one of the things that you and I share is a pragmatic view that it is important to satisfy both of those boxes. Like I think that we both have the humility as scientists to acknowledge that we don't have all the data that could possibly be needed to answer every question in lifting. And so therefore, if we see these very legitimate, very repeatable anecdotes, we should probably at least try to make those fit our working understanding of these really key concepts. Now, that doesn't mean if we have data soundly rejecting these anecdotes, we say, well, I'm going with the anecdote, right? But especially in areas where there is relatively sparse data available and things that have to be looked at fairly indirectly in most cases, you would prefer some degree of compatibility with these very, very repeatable, generalizable anecdotes. Having said that, I do have 2 questions that I don't think that they push your working model of this, but I do think they are worth addressing in the sense that people at home might be wondering how these fit. So the first question I have is, if I'm understanding correctly, we're seeing that over time, our dose of training needs to be high enough to reach basically the highest level of advancement that we wish to achieve, right? And plateaus often are experienced, or perceived plateaus, where maybe our gains haven't grinded to a halt, but they have grinded to a snail's pace, and we were thinking more cheetah, right? So what we need to do is, make sure that we increase our dose to an extent that will get us back to what we see as an acceptable rate of gains, and then ultimately make sure that the absolute amount of that dose is high enough to reach the highest level that we have in mind. But within that framework, why not start out, fairly early into your intermediate stage with just a super high dose of training? Like, why wait and say, well, I'm going to go ahead and add a couple sets here, wait for my plateau and feel like I'm really grinding to a halt, and then I'll add just a little bit. I mean, we're lifters. We're maximalists in every way possible. Why not just say, screw it? If Helms right now needs, 30, 35 sets a week, eventually I will too. So why don't I jump to that fairly early in the process and try to get that super steep curve going?
I'm so glad you asked that, because this conceptual model and explanation that we've been working with is essentially operating in a vacuum where we don't consider environmental constraints. And I think environmental constraints are often something, because of our maximalist nature, that we go, yeah, sure, that's for other people, but I'll work around that. And I don't think we acknowledge the realities that I would say in 90% of cases, and I include elite athletes in this, that is actually the thing that prevents the theoretical optimal rate of gain. Because the thing that this relationship exists on the background of is all the other things that can modify the rate of progress and the rate of recovery, and potentially constrain the amount of stimulus that you could even provide and benefit from. So you take the same example of someone who's only going to eat 1 gram per kilogram of protein, and now all of a sudden there might be a point, I don't know how this actual relationship works, where theoretically you're doing so much volume that you're actually creating an unsustainable environment and you can't recover and you can't do the theoretical amount that you'd benefit from. Or you take an environment where someone is only sleeping 5 hours, right? Or you take somebody who had an injury in high school and there's potential tolerance limits for certain movements at certain proximity to failures to certain loads or in certain rep ranges or ranges of motion that make it practically unfeasible for them to train in the way that could get them there. Or if we're talking about the novice who's a maximalist, yeah, if they could do an appropriate proximity to failure, keeping the target musculature engaged for X number of sets, they'd max out their gains, but they can't do those things. And also the difference between them maxing out their gains and not maxing out could be a threefold difference in volume because they're so responsive as a novice that 10 sets would get them the same amount of 30 sets. Even if we could do a meta-regression with 5,000 people, we'd be like, yeah, but actually there is a 0.02 effect size benefit that's real. We categorize as trivial to if you went up to 30. And then we think, well, all right, was that worth it? And here's where the practical constraints come in. For example, I'm not saying that higher volumes are associated with higher risk of injury, but I will say this, Trex, we count injuries per 1,000 hours of training. And I'm pretty sure that if you went from 10 sets to 30 sets, that it would probably require, and I'm going to estimate here very broadly, 3 times as much time, approximately, or somewhere in that range if you started using like antagonist paired sets and you started doing drop sets, et cetera, to get there. Substantially more time in the gym, and you would be, by definition, potentially increasing your rate of exposure to injuries, not because of volume, just because of the time spent training. And I would also put forth that I don't think we can predict the amount of time off or the amount of losses someone might experience from those injuries that they'd be incurring at a higher rate, which could result in a tortoise versus hare scenario.
Yeah.
So there's 2 factors I'm getting here is 1, there is a risk to doing the most amount you could possibly benefit from to where it ends up being something that is not beneficial. And that's only assuming you have created the perfect environmental storm to where you are just there to adapt. You know, you are truly a muscle farmer. You're getting your 9 hours of sleep per night. You got your macronutrients, micronutrients, phytonutrients, lifestyle, stress, everything perfectly set up. You are living to bodybuild and bodybuilding to live. I mean, I try to get to that as close as possible, but I still got stuff going on in my life. So you can benefit from it. You've actually created an environment where you can do all that. And I think in most cases, you can't. And the relationship, even if we were to do a meta-regression, which by the way is coming, shout out to Pelland and colleagues, this is going to be on the horizon pretty soon. I would guess that constraint of what's an appropriate dose is probably going to be related to the average environmental constraints that exist in the population studied, rather than some type of stimulus limit that exists inside of our Titan molecule or something like that, you know?
Yeah. And I think you're in the clear with your alarmist talk about injury. I know that you probably noceboed tens of thousands of people here, but I will personally award you the Biopsychosocial Presidential Medal of Freedom for the way that you described when you said someone had an injury from back in high school, and maybe, possibly, in some ranges of motion with certain loads, there may be something resembling an intolerance. The way that you described that, I want to clip that and use it for the rest of my life. And when I was a kid, the old timers in the gym called that their bum knee from back in the day. But you managed to make it probably a 36-word sentence. And I just very much appreciate that. But you're right, though. I mean, like, I think people who may have a tendency to be critical of your discussion about super high volumes and just increased exposure to a thing that in small rates is still considered injurious over, you know, the long run. It's kind of like, I'm not saying that if you go swimming once, you're going to get eaten by a shark, but you're probably not doing yourself any favors if you surf, like, you know, 7 days a week. Yeah, you're kind of increasing your exposure there. You know, not many people get bitten by sharks, but, you know, a good way to minimize the likelihood is by maybe not spending 4 hours out on a surfboard that makes you look like a seal. You know what I'm saying?
100%.
Okay, the other question I had, if I may.
Yes.
This is just something like a little scenario to kind of test some of the limits of how you would operationally define this model or explain it. But whenever I hear folks talking about the amount of volume you need to get to a certain level, and what dose of training is enough to elicit a certain response and get to a certain training status, everyone treats volume in these types of discussions, understandably, as a fairly linear thing. And the one set of studies that I'm curious about how you would you would describe their findings in light of this model you've laid out, or kind of mental model, so to speak, of how this stuff fits together. There were a couple studies by Ogasawara and colleagues, 2011, 2013. The 2013 one was a fairly extensive 6-month training study, which is pretty solid. And the idea with this study in general is that some folks lifted for this 24-week period, 24 weeks, 6 months. But another group, instead of just lifting for those 24 weeks, they kind of alternated between 6 weeks of training and 3 weeks off. So going back and forth. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they did that for 24 weeks.
Yep. So there's the 16-week version of the study, then the 24-week version.
Okay, yeah. So they didn't complete the same number of training weeks. They completed the same duration of the study.
Correct.
Yeah, which meant they spent several weeks on the sidelines while the other group was training. And, the main finding, the kind of conclusion takeaway, according to the authors, was that improvements in muscle cross-sectional area and strength were similar between the groups, despite this disparity in the total volume that happened in these, fairly substantial 3-week detraining periods. So how would you kind of work those findings into this conceptual model? And I think it's also fair to, if you feel inclined, challenge the findings, right? Because this is not something that's been shown time and time again in large sample studies. So what do you make of that particular line of research, which is admittedly quite sparse?
Yeah, I think this implies what we would think of as a resensitization effect. Right? I think a very, very important thing to remember is that during these 3-week detraining period, I think what often gets focused on is these folks who trained for 6 weeks and took 3 weeks off, and trained for 6 weeks and took 3 weeks off, and then trained for 6 weeks. They had these, it was either 2 or 3 3-week periods of not training, yet they still got to the same place as the folks who trained 24 weeks comparatively, is the end point and the fact that they didn't do as much training.
Mm-hmm.
What they're forgetting, though, is that they are actually experiencing detraining during those 3-week periods. And this is critical. So if we go back to the mental model of the minimum effective dose escalating as you adapt more and more and more, what we're observing here is a group of people who are untrained at the start of this 24-week period. So at each end of a 6-week cycle, they're at some stage of later stage novice than untrained. And during the next 3 weeks, they decay to some less trained version of a novice, which means that when they restart training, they now have a lower effective minimum dose, which means that the same training before, which got them there, is now more effective. So they're seeing this compensatory increase in the slope of progress they get for a given unit of volume that then stops once they get back to that new place they get to.
Yeah.
And I think the critical aspect to remember is that they got to the same place eventually. And there's 2 potential outcomes if we stretch this out into infinity, and we did a 48-week version, and then we did a 72-week version, is that maybe that relationship stays the same. And these resensitization, it is actually true resensitization, where this group would actually end up surpassing the group that kept training continuously. But what I think is also a potential outcome, which could occur, is that they would stop being able to get back to the same place as that other group.
Yeah.
Right? Because that slope gets a little bit less each time because they're not getting as high each time. So they're not regressing quite as far. And we actually end up start to see the continuous training group pull away at some point a few years down the line. As that continuous training group is reaching higher levels of training status and is never actually, this is assuming that they could keep maintaining on the amount of volume that they were doing. Because another way of thinking of taking time off is effectively doing 2/3 of the volume of the other group.
Yeah.
So there's a reality. Or let's say if we use my mental model and we assume that the volume done in the group that is training continuously is sufficient to get them to, let's say, advanced status, maybe not elite, but advanced, that the other group would always end up falling short of that because they detrained a little bit each time they got close, and it was an insufficient amount to get them all the way up there, or that they'd get there later because of that detraining effect. So either there's resensitization and that might surpass them, or it is something more like the latter, where you would see a late stage reaching of the advanced status by the group taking the time off eventually. But I think in the 6-month time period, which coincides, if we look at that study by Steele, where people plateaued, doing only 1 set per week, far less than they were doing in the Ogasawara study, because they're doing 3 sets of 10, 3 days per week. So we're talking about a 9-fold difference in volume here, right? For a population that we know, based upon Steele's study, can make gains for 1 to 2 years, doing 1/9 of that, importantly. So they're doing far beyond what they need to maintain things, and then losing a little bit during those 3 weeks. So I think there's a possibility, there's a world where either one of those outcomes occurs, and we don't really know to what degree and in what circumstances there's a resensitization effect or simply a regain of lost training status that occurs at a faster rate because you're by definition at a lower training status and therefore more responsive.
Yeah. I mean, I know where my money would be if people were taking bets on that. I definitely feel that the kind of latter explanation, not the one where there's dramatic resensitization and they start to break away from the pack, I find the opposite finding to be more likely. Like you said, we probably need more data to conclusively make that claim, but I've always struggled with this idea that somehow you would be, having this pretty substantial detraining period interspersed fairly routinely, and the idea that would yield a dramatic benefit in the long run with considerably less accumulated volume. That's always struck me as kind of difficult to sink my teeth into. And I think the alternative explanation, in my opinion, is certainly far more parsimonious. It does not rely on the robustness of a very strong resensitization effect, for which we don't have a tremendous amount of really high quality evidence linking it to substantial longitudinal differences. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And here's a way that we can flip it on its head, ask a different question, change the assumptions, and kind of test our priors, if you will. Let's take the study designed by Steele. We've got people doing 1 set per week to failure for 7 years. Do we think that if we took a subset of them and we had them train 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, meaning that 3 weeks in a row they were doing nothing, and then 6 weeks in a row they're doing 1 set to failure, that at the 2-year mark, they would all be plateaued at the same point? I really struggle with that because as a personal trainer, I had a lot of clients who would miss a ton of sessions. They're coming in twice per week with me. They're probably doing a total of 3 to 6 sets per muscle group. They're not ready to train to failure because they don't like it, and I want them to be, they want it here in the gym. And more often what I would see is they would take some time off for vacation, and they would pretty rapidly get back to where they were, but they wouldn't progress past it. And I could never get them past the intermediate hump with the level of training that they wanted. And then I think, okay, what if instead of coming in twice per week, they came in once per week? And instead of getting a couple sets per muscle group that I could actually have them take to the house, they just got 1. And then I think, what if I purposely had them take a vacation every 6 weeks? I think they would regress.
Yeah.
I really do. So I think the fact that Ogasawara observed what they did, somewhat baked into it is the fact that they have a reasonably moderate training dose in the first place. They're doing 3 sets of 10, 3 days per week, not one set once per week. And I think if we ask most people, all right, if you apply the same Ogasawara model to this 7-year modeling study, I actually think we see the opposite. My guess, my hypothesis, which I don't have data to back up except for anecdote, is that those people would be plateauing later than the group that is training consistently. So that to me would indicate probably we're not looking at true resensitization. We're looking at an increase in slope due to detraining and regaining what you were getting.
All right, Helms. I'm satisfied with both of your retorts. I'm sorry it got so heated and contentious, but
that's all right.
But no, I mean, I think you've done this idea a lot of justice. I know that it's not a fully formed, 100% baked idea that you're going to be trademarking anytime soon, but...
Well, 3rd editions are coming out, and I do have to explain the difference between these different doses, so hold your horses.
There you go. But no, I think I really like the way that this episode came together. I think this is a nice informative chat, and I think there's a lot of food for thought and for future discussion and debate within the fitness world. But certainly, as far as I can tell, a very sensible, very cohesive way to kind of put together these many, many different questions and pieces of evidence related to volume. Or I should say, training dose.
That's right. Trex, literally could not have done it without you. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the focusing. And this was a really fun exploration for me. And I also really want to reiterate how much I appreciate the data-driven strength guys. I'm very much taking a lot of the content that they've talked about in their last 2 podcast episodes. I'm not co-opting or appropriating it, but it stimulated a lot of additional thought in my head because I've been wrestling with this concept for a while in trying to write the 3rd edition of my books, conceptualize things, think about it. And from the very, very first videos I made on the muscle and strength training pyramids back on my Samsung S3 and the small conference room at Sprins during my PhD back in, say, 2015, I wasn't comfortable with the idea of saying that you need to do more volume over time because it would just get crazy. And the reality is you don't. But you do need to do more of a dose if you want to approximate the rate of gains that you made as an intermediate when you are, as an intermediate when you're advanced, or as a novice when you're now intermediate. And you won't even get to the intermediate or advanced status if your dose is too low in the first place. And those 2 additional pieces, and then the interaction with all the environmental factors, individual genetic factors that may or may not play a major role, we shall see, more data needed, and everything else that comes into making the efficiency of the dose change, I think like, oh, this actually is robust to the observations, it's robust to the data, it makes sense. And when people ask me questions, it doesn't go, oh, well, I guess that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't match up. So thank you for that. And I really encourage the listener, definitely check out those other resources to get an even further understanding on this. Get some arguably smarter people than myself. Dr. Zach Robinson is the man. Data-driven strength, they're doing great work.
And also, I do have a question,
yes,
if I may.
Please do.
I do wonder. I think that if you go back a year ago, some of the predictions about what AI would or would not do in the very short-term time horizon, I think some things were overstated. But one area that I'm curious about is next time you hear one of their podcast episodes that you enjoy, you've been making a lot of like pretty straightforward content where you are just sitting in front of a camera, talking at it for hours on end, going all the way back over a decade. I do wonder if we're at the point where we can just take a transcript from one of their episodes, feed it into some type of software, and just produce your half of the screen, just kind of saying those words, but with your voice and your likeness, your image. I feel like it could be a tremendous time saver, which could really cut costs over at the floundering operation of Iron Culture. So it's something worth considering. And also,
Absolutely.
as a bonus, a very ethical thing to do.
A win-win, if you will.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I love that idea. We're going to have Brandon edit this out just in case the data-driven strength guys are listening. And yeah, if you are interested in our next episode of Iron Culture, which is actually an episode of some other podcast that has been AI edited to look like me, Omar, and sound like Trexler, then you're in the right place. So if you want repurposed, appropriated content done to a photo or video realistic standard, stay tuned as AI advances and as we become far less ethical, but have a lot more time on our hands to do more unethical things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be making more of those posts where I'm near a pool in a beautiful sunny place saying, I work 3 hours a week from my laptop. Why do you go to work every day?
Exactly, because the work we're doing is just taking other people's work to make it look like our work. And guess what, folks? That shit works. Or it will work once AI gets on the right level. So with that very, very serious business plan that we're going to implement, and we suggest to everyone else that is also ethically defensible in all ways, as far as I can tell, I want to say thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. This has been one of our science-heavier episodes, but I also liked that it wasn't just us citing data. We were playing with it. We were thinking about it. We discussed the practical implications. We made sure that it met the anecdotes, because that's what Iron Culture is about. Not only the science, but also the history and the culture. And you, dear listener, are a huge part of that. So do your part, and please give us a 5-star rating. Give us a like, a thumbs up. Give us a review. Omar loves reading your guys' reviews. Myself, you know my feelings on them. They need to be impeccable and to a very non-Trojan horse standard of 5 stars for me to feel good about them. But I do encourage you to leave them. And if you're unsure what type of review to leave, that's okay. Just save it for next time. Let someone else who has a glowingly positive 5-star review to leave it. They'll do it. And I will catch you in that very next episode of Iron Culture. Insert date here.